A few days ago, I stumbled upon Reverb's top 10 best-selling guitars of 2025. If you're unaware, Reverb.com is one of the world's most prominent online markets for buying and selling used music gear, including, of course, electric guitars. And when I took a look at that list, I was surprised because the list is paradoxically unsurprising. Out of the top 10 guitars sold on Reverb for 2025, 5 are Strats, 2 are Les Pauls, and 3 are Tellys. See what I mean? Let's look at that list. Number 10, the Fender Player 2 Stratocaster. Number 9, the Player Telly. Number 8, the Player Telly 2. Number 7, the PRS Silver Sky USA model. Number 6, Fender American Professional 2 Telly. Number 5, the Gibson Les Paul Standard 50s. Number 4, the Fender Player Strat. Number 3, the Gibson Les Paul Standard 60s. Number 2, the PRS Silver Sky SE model. And number 1, the Fender American Professional 2 Stratocaster. And furthermore, all of the Strats and Tellys are specifically Fenders, except for the 2 PRS Silver Skies, and both the Les Paul entries are Gibsons. Squiers and Epiphones don't even make the list. I think it's well established for all of us that Fender, Gibson and PRS are the 3 biggest guitar brands in the world, PRS being the newest brand to achieve that status when compared to the Big F and the Big G. But I was still taken aback by their complete dominance over the top 10 of Reverb sales. If you asked me before looking at the list, I would probably put these 3 brands on the list for sure, but I would expect to see Ibanez, Squier, Epiphone, and maybe a model from PRS other than the Silver Sky, but no. We guitar players are as predictable as possible, which in itself would not be my prediction. In today's video, I want to talk to you about a topic I've been thinking about for a while, which is modern versus vintage specs in electric guitars, what those differences are and why, according to this list, guitar players heavily lean towards the vintage spec rather than the modern approach. And guys, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. I'm currently at 680 subscribers, but can we get to 1,000? With your help, I'm sure we can. So please hit that subscribe button, it would be super helpful. Alright, back to the video. Before we look at what modern and vintage specs are and aren't, let's clarify a few things about this Reverb list. First off, we don't really know who Reverb's customers are, meaning we could have a mix of beginners, hobbyists and professionals from different age groups and nationalities. Or we could have a totally skewed demographic that's made up, I don't know, mostly of professional musicians, for example. We don't really know for sure who the customers are, and that in itself could impact the type of guitars these customers bought. We see at number 1 we have the Fender American Professional 2 Strat, which is a very expensive USA-made guitar, not something you'd expect a beginner to buy, for example. So take this data with a pinch of salt. So what are vintage and modern specs in electric guitars? I think this is a broad category that's difficult to define super well, because some vintage specs are so universal they're not even considered vintage. Take Gibson's traditional fingerboard radius. It's always been 12 inches, and I don't think anyone would consider a 12-inch radius to be a vintage spec in itself. A lot of modern spec'd guitars use 12-inch radius in their builds, and we don't call that vintage. Difficult and uncertain as it may be, let's try to articulate what specs in what contexts make for a vintage build. 7/25 or 7¼ inch is the original specification of the fingerboard radius for both the Stratocaster and the Telecaster. But many modern models by Fender, like the American Professional 2 or other brands that have their own Strat and Telly copies, do not use the traditional 7/25 radius. I know this is a super hot topic for a lot of us, so let me articulate both sides before giving you an opinion. Some players defend that 7/25 makes bending more difficult, creating chokeout points higher in the neck because of the fingerboard's curvature, while other players argue that curved fingerboards make chords a lot easier to fret. I do currently own a Fender Vintero Strat, which has a 7/25 fingerboard, and I also own an Ibanez RG with a 15-inch radius. These two couldn't be more different, and I like them both. I don't find 7/25 to make bending harder at all, but some notes do choke higher on the fretboard. But if I'm honest, that happens very rarely, and it's never actually been a problem, at least on this Fender. I've owned a vintage spec'd Japanese-made Fender Strat that choked on almost every note past the 12th fret, so naturally I had to sell that one. And when compared to the Ibanez, there's some differences in how bending notes feels, but that also has a lot to do with the fret wire and the bridge. It's also a lot easier to fret complicated chord shapes on the Fender than on the Ibanez. But I suspect the fact that the Fender is a far more expensive guitar with a much more polished fingerboard with rolled edges contributes more to that than the actual fingerboard radius. So what's the verdict on fingerboard radius? To me, it's not really a factor. If the guitar feels and plays great, it's a spec I learned to forget about, especially after I bought this Vintera and realized I could bend every note with no choking. But let me repeat, that's not true for every guitar, so always try before you buy. So what other specs can be considered vintage? There's frets, which generally are smaller in vintage specs and bigger in modern. Modern construction also offers stainless steel frets, which change the way the guitar feels and sounds. I'm personally a big fan of jumbo stainless steel frets, which I got to play on an Ibanez AZ and the Tom Anderson I used to own, because they make bending very fluid and give a slightly brighter sound to the instrument. But then again, I love my Vintera and it's got small frets made of nickel. So again, both modern and vintage fret construction work well, they just have different sounds and feels. One of the more interesting vintage versus modern specs are probably bridges. Guitar bridges are actually a majorly important part of our instruments that we sometimes overlook. Even if you ignore everything else, the bridge construction is probably one of the most important points of distinction between a modern spec and a vintage spec. If we look at Telecasters, for example, traditional 3-saddle tele bridges are famous for being hard to keep well intonated, so much so that some modern models use a 6-saddle bridge with a very different design to help keep the guitar intonated more easily. I've owned 3 Telecasters, one with the modern bridge and 2 with the vintage ones, and I've never had an intonation problem in any of them. I love Telecasters especially because they're easy to maintain and to keep in tune. Some people go as far as to say the traditional 3-saddle bridge helps create the twangy sound we all love. Stratocasters and S-type bridges are probably where we see the biggest difference between a vintage and a modern spec. When the Strat came out in the 50s, its bridge design and ergonomics quickly made it a very futuristic guitar when compared to the Tele and the Les Paul. And the sounds of the Strat inspired many other brands to create their own guitars based on it, but different. Take Ibanez, for example, a brand known for making guitars that don't look like anyone else's and introduce new designs. The RG line from Ibanez is one of the most interesting takes on the Super Strat, which is the idea of taking the historical body shape of a Strat and turning it into a rock monster with an HSS configuration, or even dual humbuckers, a flat fingerboard radius, and minimal knobs and switches. You won't find vintage spec guitars on the Ibanez line for the most part. Recently, they came out with the AZ line, which is a brilliant take on the traditional Strat and Tele, but with some Ibanez twists like a compound radius, Seymour Duncan pickups, and stainless steel frets, to give you a taste of vintage construction, but with modern quality of life improvements. A few other specs that vary from vintage to modern are the number of frets on a guitar, which were initially 21 for Fender and 22 for Gibson, but this began to change in the 80s as the Super Strat became more popular and brands like Ibanez and Jackson started introducing 24-fret guitars, like the Ibanez Gem, Steve Vai's signature model. And to me, it seems like the 1980s were the most important period in shaping what we today call the modern spec. Because until that period, music didn't have the need for super fast necks, flat fingerboards or 24 frets. But because of the heavy metal shred revolution of the 80s, brands quickly started offering guitars that responded to this trend in technical playing. And while I'm leaving out many other specs that can be split between a vintage and a modern version, like tuners, types of pickups and sound, finishes, neck carves, and even electronic configurations, I think in a general sense brands decide on these specs based on who they think a given guitar model is for and who their audience is on a broader sense. For example, Ibanez knows that a vast segment of their customers are metal players or players who like technical music. Fender, on the other hand, has a completely different segment of customers, more based on players who like rock, indie or punk, usually but not always a less technical genre that requires a tone that's best suited to Fender's single coils. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between these brands, but sticking to the general idea, this is how these markets are separated. Hopefully this gave you a better idea of what these terms mean. In today's world, vintage and modern spec are more of a marketing term than anything super significant. As I said earlier, there's tons of models out there that offer almost every possible combination of specs we could want. You can get a modern Les Paul from Gibson, or a vintage Les Paul from, well, Gibson. And the same thing goes for Fender. You can get a Vintera, vintage era, or an American Professional, which is the modern take on the Fender Classic. Which one is better? I don't think there's a better one, really, just the one you vibe with more. Do they even sound any different? They probably do, but I'm not sure the sound difference is gonna be more significant than the feel or vibe difference. I'm personally extremely partial to the vintage vibe in terms of aesthetic. To me, there's hardly anything better looking than a vintage spec Fender or Gibson guitar. But I can also appreciate the high-octane performance of an Ibanez RG, for example. So as usual, having multiple options in your arsenal is of course always preferable. But when you need to choose only one, say it's your first guitar or you need to sell one to get another, I would argue you should go to a store and try the guitars. Ignore the modern and vintage labels completely and choose what feels best. Unless you want to play metal, in which case it's unlikely that a vintage spec'd guitar will suit your performance and sound needs. And with all of that being said, why is it that 10 out of 10 guitars in the top of Reverb's list are pretty much reissues of the 3 original electric guitar models? Let me clarify that even though these are all Strats, Tellys and Les Pauls, they're not all vintage spec'd, meaning they're not all spec'd after the original models from the 50s. For example, the American Professionals have a 9.5 radius, and lots of modern electronic configurations that give you variations in the sound of the pickups. The Player series are also 9.5 radius, and the Silver Sky have some vintage specs, like the 725 radius, but they're kind of their own thing in some aspects. But the Les Pauls are actually Gibson's most recent vintage line, trying to emulate old Les Pauls as much as possible. And why is it that we seemingly lean towards these traditional models so much? Well, first off, I'm not sure this list tells the full story. I'm sure we would probably find different data if we put together lists from multiple vendors from all around the world. It could even be interesting to see if there's any regional variances in different countries, for example. But this data does tell a story in itself. The original electric guitars marked multiple generations and built the entire industry we see today. These are the most popular guitar models because they stood the test of time and their original specifications were already pretty dialed in. Yes, modern construction allows for more consistency between models, overcoming some problems that existed in the originals and a lot of new variations. But the originals did so many things right that we keep going back to them. Oh, and marketing too, of course. Fender's pretty good at marketing. So I think those are the biggest reasons why vintage specs and old guitar models don't go away, because they do most of what we need and because they keep inspiring us. But modern guitars are awesome too. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe, it would help me a lot. And let me know in the comments what you think about vintage versus modern specs on guitars. Do you have a preference? Anyway, thanks for watching, I'll see you next time, bye bye.